Department of I know, it's not me. I'm going to keep going. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where these videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. And if you've not already done so, please silence your phones. We'll have another Community Curation Day this Saturday, November 4th at 10 a.m. next door in the Winter Building. Our photo curator, Jeff Rogers, will teach you how to preserve, to store, to display your photographs, your negatives, and your slides, and we'll be giving away archival supplies. So that's at 10 a.m. this Saturday at the Winter Building. And then I hope you'll join us here in the auditorium for a screening of Little Satchmo on Sunday, November 5th at 2 p.m. The documentary tells the story of the daughter of Louis Armstrong, who had a close relationship with her father, but whose existence was kept secret to the outside world. The film won a Southeast Emmy Award for Outstanding Historical Documentary, and following the screening, we'll have a Q&A with the director, John Alexander, and Mississippi's own Vasti Jackson about life on the road. Many of you know our staff member Hezekiah Watkins, who became the youngest freedom rider when he was arrested in Jackson at age 13. He'll be giving a gallery talk this Saturday, November 4th at noon in the Central Gallery of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And if you have not heard Brother Heck give his story, you owe it to yourself to come and catch that. And I hope that you'll join us next week for History is Lunch, when Dale Beasley will be with us to talk about his book that collects wartime letters of Mississippi soldiers, We Will Not Be Home by Christmas. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Beverly Gage to talk about J. Edgar Hoover and Mississippi. Gage was scheduled to be with us just days after it was announced she'd won this year's Pulitzer Prize for biography for her book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. She had to reschedule, and we're excited to have her here today. Beverly Gage is professor of 20th century U.S. history at Yale University. She earned her B.A. in American Studies from Yale and her Ph.D. in history from Columbia University. In addition to the Pulitzer, her book G-Man received the Bancroft Prize in American History, the National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Biography, and was named a Best Book of 2022 by the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Publishers Weekly, the New Yorker, the New York Times, and Smithsonian. Help me welcome Beverly Gage.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thanks to all of you for being here today. Thank you to the staff of the museum and the archives. I'm looking forward to spending the afternoon looking around here a little bit. It's an exciting place to be. For the talk today, I thought that I would not tell you everything that is inside this 800-page book that's sitting over there, but instead give you a little bit of an overview about J. Edgar Hoover, particularly his relationship to civil rights and civil rights investigations, and then really focus on 1964, Hoover's relationship with Lyndon Johnson, and particular the ways in which that intersected with Mississippi events and Mississippi history. I should say, in saying that I've written this 800-page book, it is a book that has short chapters, though it is very long. I spent about a decade or so working on this book, and so it's a great delight not only to have it out in the world, but to be able to speak with all of you about it. I should also preface my remarks by saying that while I know a good deal about some of the cases in Mississippi, I am quite sure there are many people in the audience who know even more about the details of those cases. So I'm going to try to give an overview, give a sense of what it all looked like from Hoover's perspective, and then hopefully in the Q&A we'll have some time to get into the details. So I wanted to start off today with a document. Wanted to start with this document for a few reasons. First, we are here in a museum that is attached to a state archives, and I want to encourage everyone to get out and do your own historical research in addition to coming to talks like this. But this is a document from late 1964. It is an anonymous letter that the FBI sent to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, in which they are posing as a black admirer of King's and saying, you know, Martin Luther King, I used to respect you, I used to admire you, but now I've found out who you really are. I no longer believe in you. And famously, at the end of this letter, there's this phrase at the bottom there, King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. This was an FBI dirty tricks operation aimed at King. This letter was accompanied by a reel of audio recordings that had been made in King's hotel rooms over the course of 1964, documenting his extramarital sex life. So the FBI sent the tape, they sent this letter along, and King, when he received it, interpreted it as an effort by the Bureau. He wasn't fooled into thinking that this had simply come from an anonymous admirer, ex-admirer, but he interpreted it as an admonition to try not only to force him out of public life, but to get him to kill himself. And so this has been known ever since as the suicide letter. So I'm starting with it not only to encourage you to do historical research, but for two other reasons. So one is that this letter first became known widely and publicly in the 1970s. And so when I set out a decade and a half ago or so thinking about J. Edgar Hoover, I knew about this letter, and it seemed to epitomize one of the things that I wanted to do with this biography. First of all, I think it captures what most people know about J. Edgar Hoover in this day and age, which is that he is largely interpreted as a villain. He is famous for his opposition to infiltration of and attempts to disrupt the civil rights movement and to go after Martin Luther King in particular. And I wanted to be able to explain in this book how we got to this moment in late 1964, early 1965, when the FBI was engaged in this sort of operation, right? Because we can capture that moment, but that moment has a history. Who was Hoover, and how did he come to authorize this kind of operation? That was really one of the stories that I wanted to tell in the book. How did we get from some earlier moment when there was no Bureau of Investigation to this famous moment in late 1964 when he authorized this operation. And I think in doing that, I tried to tell a story that's there in this biography that doesn't minimize in any way operations like this. In fact, has some new details about the FBI's campaign against King in particular, as well as others, but actually tells a slightly more complicated story than we're used to hearing about where the FBI's ideas and operations came from, who Hoover was, and how he got to this point that he could be doing this in 1964. So I would say it is in no way a biography that attempts to redeem J. Edgar Hoover, but it does attempt to tell a more complicated story than we usually hear about the exercise of power, how his power was built, and what he did with it. The other reason that I wanted to start with this is that that document there is probably the best thing that I personally have ever found in the archives, because as I said, that letter was known from the 1970s onward, largely through the work of the Church Committee, but until 2014, this was what we had been able to see publicly, right? A draft of it, heavily redacted, and when I started this project, that's all that I had ever seen as well. But I sent an undergraduate research assistant down to the National Archives in Maryland, to look at J. Edgar Hoover's official and confidential files. Those were some of his most secret files on very high-profile people. There had been microfilm editions, there had been versions of this letter floating out there, but I said, no, I want to go to the archive itself and see if there are things in there that might be new. And in the course of that, he came across the first unredacted version of that letter, which then I ended up writing about for the New York Times Magazine and releasing into the world. So when you go online now, it's floating all over the internet. You can thank my undergraduate research assistant who spent a lot of time in College Park, Maryland, taking document photos for me. So what I want to do today is, as I said, give a little bit of an overview, but try to explain that story. How did we get to this moment in late 1964? And there are two pieces that I'm really going to emphasize. First is a little bit about Hoover and the early Bureau, how they began to grow and come to this moment in 1964. And then the second will be really drilling down on the year 1964, particularly telling the story of Hoover, Lyndon Johnson, and Mississippi, and those critical events. All right, to start out, here is young J. Edgar Hoover. It's important to show some photos, I think, of young J. Edgar Hoover, because today almost everyone thinks about Hoover as he was in the 60s and 70s, right? This kind of jowly old man, the man who is, in fact, on the cover of that book. And one of the things that I like about the design of the book is that one of his eyes is looking out at you over the book spine. So when you put it on your shelf, J. Edgar Hoover watches you wherever you go, which I thought was really a brilliant piece of design. But here is J. Edgar Hoover, in fact, as a young person. I should note this is the only existing photo of J. Edgar Hoover in a dress, and I'm happy to talk about Hoover's sexuality, many of the rumors about his various predilections in the Q&A, if you'd like. But this is Hoover, born in 1895 in Washington, D.C. And while I'm going to talk quite a lot about Mississippi today, Washington, D.C. is really the centerpiece of the biography. It is the place that Hoover was born. It's the place that he died. And he never lived anywhere else. And so Hoover's story, I think, is interesting biographically in its own right. But my goal with this book was also to make it a story about Washington, the city, and the capital, and as the site of the federal government, and talk about the ways all of that was transformed from Hoover's birth in 1895 to his death in that city in 1972, right? A period in which the federal government grew enormously, in which the city of Washington was transformed really from something of a backwater in the late 19th century into a true center of national and global power. So Hoover is born there in 1895. He comes of age in the Washington public schools. He goes to a segregated white high school and elementary school in Washington, D.C., goes on to George Washington University, which I'll talk more about in a minute. I think there are two important things to understand about his early years in Washington. One is that he comes of age in a family that has been committed to government service, and particularly to federal service, already for a couple of generations in 1895. Now, that's incredibly unusual in the late 19th century. As I said, the federal government is very different than the way that we think about it today. There aren't that many people who have had generations of federal service, but Hoover is born into that family, and he's born into a Washington that's really organized around the idea of kind of federal service that is a little bit different from politics. At the moment that he's born, D.C. residents cannot vote. They do not join political parties, and in fact, Hoover spends his whole life never casting a vote in the United States. So he comes of age in this culture, and I think he really holds on to it for much of his life, right? He's born into the progressive era. It's an era that is imbued with ideas about the nobility of federal federal service, values expertise, values the use of science, is part of the vast expansion of an administrative state that is going to come of age over his lifetime. And he really builds the Bureau out of those ideas about career, nonpartisan government service that's a service of professionals and experts and scientists. He's born into it, and he builds the Bureau around a lot of those ideas. The second thing that's really important about the Washington of his childhood is that it is a city that is actively undergoing the process of racial segregation, right? Washington during these years is essentially a southern city. When Hoover is growing up, I said he goes to segregated schools, he goes to a segregated university, but this is an active process during the years that he is a young man. His first job in the government, where he does this while he's in law school at GW. He works at the Library of Congress by day. Under the Wilson administration, this is a moment when federal employment is becoming formally racially segregated for the first time. And I think both of these ideas are important because really the kind of political puzzle of this book, and I think what's essential to understand about Hoover's career is that he builds the FBI at the intersection of sort of these two political traditions. On the one hand, a real belief in progressive ideas about expert, professional, nonpartisan career government service. And then on the other hand, a set of very conservative ideas, not only about race, but about religion, about law and order, about anti-communism. And he really fuses these two together to create the FBI as it was known in his day, to some degree, as it still exists today. It's a very particular culture. I think it's essential for understanding Hoover, but it's also a set of ideas that we don't see combined all that often in our own moment, when, of course, conservatives in our own language are often understood to be opposed to the federal government, opposed to the administrative state, the federal bureaucracy. You can see wars on the FBI at the moment, mostly coming not from the left, as they often would during Hoover's life, but critics coming from the right. So that's really the political theme of this book, of Hoover's career in many ways, and I think it's important not only to the history of the Bureau, but to the ways in which he carries out civil rights investigations. So there he is in high school. So I want to mention one other thing from his early life before he enters into the Justice Department that turned out to be very important in thinking about Hoover as a person, but the Bureau as an institution. That was the fraternity that he joined when he was in law school at George Washington University. That was an undergraduate degree at the time. So he's there from 1913 to 1917. And during that time, he joins the fraternity that you can see up here, Kappa Alpha. May be familiar to some of you in the room. Kappa Alpha is still an active fraternity. Kappa Alpha, at the time Hoover joined it, had been around for about 50 years, and it had been created in the wake of the Civil War, founded in the late 1860s, really to carry on the traditions of the White South, to carry on the traditions of Robert E. Lee in particular. And when Hoover joined it, it was an all-white, explicitly Southern fraternity. Its most famous standard bearer in that moment was a man named Thomas Dixon. If you can see that image up there, he was the author of a novel called The Klansman that became the basis for the famous film Birth of a Nation, glorifying the Ku Klux Klan. That came out during Hoover's time in law school. He was very active in this fraternity and very much shaped by its ideas. And so culturally, I think we really do want to think of J. Edgar Hoover as a Southerner, even though he was of course, living in Washington, D.C. This other image is Kappa Alpha fraternity from the 1950s. They're gazing up at a portrait of Robert E. Lee there. I included that in the book because Kappa Alpha took a lot of pride in the 1950s and 60s during the period of civil rights agitation and then massive resistance in helping to popularize the Confederate battle flag as a symbol, and so it was a prominent symbol of the fraternity. So Hoover graduates from law school in 1917. Those of you who are historians or history buffs in the audience know that the spring of 1917 is a very important moment. It's the moment that the United States is entering the First World War. He does not go into military service, but instead he goes straight into the Department of Justice, and he remains there for the rest of his life. So he spends 55 years in the Department of Justice, and ultimately spends 48 of them as director of the FBI. Hoover has a couple of initial jobs at the Justice Department, making his way up. First, he works in German internment and registration, something we don't think a lot about now. He's so good at that, when he's 24 years old, he's appointed to head something called the Radical Division, which is a newly invented division within the Justice Department, and this little organization called the Bureau of Investigation, that is really the first peacetime attempt at surveillance of the left in particular. These are the years right after the Bolshevik Revolution. There are some controversies during those years, most notably the Palmer deportation raids. But during those early years, Hoover enters into this world in which political surveillance is really just being invented at the federal level, and he's trained in that from the very first. He manages to survive the scandals of the Palmer years and to last through the early 1920s, at which point, in 1924, at the ripe old age of 29, he becomes director of the Bureau of Investigation. I like to say that to my graduate students, like, what have you done lately, right? J. Edgar Hoover was the director of the Bureau by the time he was 29 years old. So this is a job that he gets when the Bureau is really a very small organization, a few hundred agents. They have pretty limited jurisdiction, kind of a weird grab bag of things, but it is the job that he holds for the rest of his life. And just to give you a very quick sense of what that means, so Hoover is appointed in 1924, so that is under Calvin Coolidge. He stays in that job under Herbert Hoover. They're not related. That's Herbert Hoover over there, J. Edgar Hoover near me. He then stays on for all of Franklin Roosevelt's 3+ terms. That's Roosevelt seated, and Hoover is the young man standing right behind him. He then stays on through Harry Truman, through the early years of the Cold War and of McCarthyism. He stays on for both of Dwight Eisenhower's terms, so the rest of the 1950s and those critical years of Cold War activity. He stays on under John Kennedy. He stays on under Lyndon Johnson, and then he stays on for Richard Nixon's first term and dies near the end of Nixon's first term. So the importance of that, as I said, we're not going to go into every detail of all of that. I want to get to the 1960s, but one of the appeals for me as a biographer was that incredible sweep of time, right, in which the federal government is being constructed, the security state at the federal level is being constructed, and in which J. Edgar Hoover, in particular, has his hands in just about everything. So that was one of the big appeals of writing the biography. It's also one of the reasons that it took as long as it did, because that was a lot of material to get through. So I want to go back to 1924, briefly get us up to 1964, and just offer a few highlights and themes about Hoover as he was by 1964. So the first is that Hoover really came into office as a reformer, right, a professionalizer, someone who was going to clean up a bureau that was in fairly bad repute. This is some of the promises he makes in 1924. My personal favorite is that he's never going to wiretap anyone, but he is setting out really to distinguish the bureau from what he calls, kind of flat-footed, thuggish local police. They're going to be an elite. They're going to be the models of professional law enforcement. He sets out to hire lawyers and accountants and scientists, men with college degrees, who are going to set the example for the nation. And for that first decade that he's there, he's kind of just building the bureau and its bureaucracy as much as he's doing anything else. This is a shot of what bureau publicity photos used to look like, right? A bunch of filing cabinets. And that was was deliberate because that's what Hoover wanted to convey. They were social scientists, they were professionals, they were managing information, they weren't like the cops. Then suddenly, in the 1930s, the Bureau's image changes very dramatically. This is Hoover in the middle holding a Tommy gun. So suddenly, in the 1930s, the Bureau sets out to engage in what Franklin Roosevelt describes as the war on crime. This is the moment when not only these publicity shops become famous, but when they go up against the likes of John Dillinger and other famous gangsters of the era. Why does that happen? The answer is this man sitting at the desk right here. One of the surprises to me in doing this biography was how important Franklin Roosevelt and other liberals were, particularly during the New Deal, in helping to empower Hoover to construct the Bureau and to support him. And there are a couple of different ways that all of that happened. The first is that the Bureau got vast new jurisdiction in the 1930s over a series of high-profile crimes, in particular interstate kidnapping and bank robbery. So those turned the Bureau really into a law enforcement agency in a serious way for the first time. It's when Bureau agents begin to carry guns. It's when they become known really as crime fighters. The second important thing that happens in the 1930s is that Hoover begins to engage in a publicity blitz. So many of you probably remember the kind of vast cultural stamp of Hoover and the FBI. By mid-century, a lot of that begins to be constructed in the 1930s through the Bureau's PR operations. And then the last is that the Second World War comes along, and though the Bureau hadn't been engaged in a lot of counter-espionage or surveillance work during the 20s and 30s, as the war comes along, Franklin Roosevelt turns back to J. Edgar Hoover and says, you know, we've got to begin all of this, and this is in many ways the real birth of the FBI's intelligence operations and of the FBI as our kind of domestic political police. So by the end of the war, Hoover has essentially built the FBI that we know today. It is, on the one hand, our kind of elite federal law enforcement agency. On the other hand, a federal intelligence agency. And it's in the years after the war that he begins to then take this institution and I think take a firmer hand in guiding its political direction. And in particular, he moves the Bureau very aggressively into the fight against communism in the 40s and 50s. We tend to think about Joe McCarthy as the kind of great icon of the Red Scare and of American anti-communism, but Hoover was there before McCarthy. He was there after McCarthy, right? McCarthy came and went, but in many ways the Bureau was, as they themselves described themselves, the bulwark, quote unquote, against communism. All right, all of which gets us to our civil rights story, the real subject of what I want to talk about today. And I want to say a few words first about how Hoover thought about and approached civil rights, and then talk a little bit about 1964. Then we'll have some time to get to Q&A. So I think there are a few big themes to understand when thinking about Hoover, the FBI, and civil rights. The first is that for Hoover and for many officials in the government and for many people in the United States as a whole, the question of civil rights was intensely tied to the question of communism, anti-communism, and the larger Cold War context. That's partly because the Communist Party in the 30s and 40s had been one of the few white-led organizations that really was committed to doing civil rights organizing, had its members and organizers down trying to organize in the South, particularly in Alabama. But for Hoover, one of the great questions was always, are the communists infiltrating civil rights organizations? He tended to frame almost all black organizing and civil rights organizing as part of a communist conspiracy. But there's almost nothing that happens in the FBI's approach to civil rights that doesn't in some way or another come back to that question. The second thing to say is that the FBI was constantly contending during these years, really beginning in the 1940s, but certainly up into the 1960s. I think this is 1961 or 62. This is a rally in Alabama by, I think it's the National States' Rights Party, a white supremacist organization. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this is that from the vantage point of many people in the white South, right, the FBI was itself a bunch of outside agitators, a symbol of federal power, in fact, to be actively resisted. So as the FBI began to move into civil rights investigations, that was always one of the big challenges. What was its relationship with the white South going to be, and how much cooperation would the FBI actually get from the white South? Questions of federal jurisdiction, questions of the FBI as a symbol of federal power. The third thing to say is that Hoover, when he built the Bureau in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, really built it out of the institutions that he knew best, and in fact recruited many of the earliest generations of FBI officials out of two institutions that were close to his heart. One was George Washington University, and the other was Kappa Alpha. This is from a group of alums in GW. This is showing some of the early Bureau officials who came out of GW, but I have it up here in part because of this man down at the bottom right near me, a man named Hugh Clegg, who was absolutely critical, Mississippi native, joins the Bureau, was a member of Kappa Alpha, went to GW, and Hugh Clegg becomes, like a whole generation of FBI officials, really important in helping Hoover to construct the Bureau, to construct the National Academy, and brings many of the same ideas that Hoover had into that first generation of FBI officials. The last thing that I want to mention is how Hoover strategized, beginning in the 30s even, and then escalating the 40s, 50s, not only about what his relationship to the white South was going to be, a place that he had many sympathies with, but that, as I mentioned, was often quite resistant to the exercise of federal law enforcement power, but he also had to strategize about what his relationship with Southern police departments was going to be like, right? He had a lot of need to cooperate with local law enforcement, not only in the South, but everywhere in the country. But he was often kind of suspicious of Southern law enforcement as well, as often police departments too tightly tied to the Klan, not reliable, particularly in civil rights investigations. So one of his answers to that was the FBI National Academy, which was a training academy that brought police officials from all over the country into the FBI to be trained for about 12 weeks, and then to go back to local law enforcement with some of the ideas of Hoover and of FBI policy and techniques. Hoover was very invested in getting Southern departments to send some of their folks up to Quantico to be trained by the FBI, because he thought that way he would have a network of loyal local law enforcement officials that he could turn to at various moments. So my book talks a little bit about the ways that set of relationships shaped the Freedom Rides. Another example of Hoover's kind of influence extending beyond the formal FBI is the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, right? The Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, state-level commission, mainly engaged in civil rights surveillance, is really modeled on the FBI, but is also literally being planned and carried out by ex-agents and academy graduates. And so Hoover had this very push and pull relationship with Southern law enforcement that shapes a lot of what he does as well. So the book tries to get at all of these different aspects of civil rights, and in fact to also give a lot of credit to the Bureau where that credit is due. I think overall The story of Hoover is a story about reluctance to be involved in civil rights investigations. He's certainly very reluctant in his whole career to ever hire black agents. That, of course, is not a great strategy for conducting effective investigations, particularly into racial violence. But there are moments when, often prodded by various administrations, the FBI does some surprising things. In the 1940s, and this is a chapter that I think isn't very well known, under Franklin Roosevelt and then Harry Truman, the FBI does begin to engage in anti-lynching investigations, mostly in southern states, at a moment when that is not very easy to do and not very popular. In the late 1950s, particularly after the passage of the 1957 Civil Rights Act, again, they engage in some pretty intensive investigations. The Mac Charles Parker lynching in Mississippi, the FBI does a vast investigation. It often turns out that even when the FBI can figure out who has committed acts of violence, of course, it's very hard to prosecute any of those crimes. Federal jurisdiction is somewhat limited. There's a lot of resistance, and then white juries often let people off. So Hoover does engage in some of this. He's often frustrated by it, and he has very little sympathy, of course, for the civil rights movement more broadly. That becomes even more the case once direct action becomes an important part of civil rights strategy. Hoover tends, by the early 60s, to see civil rights activists as agitators and lawbreakers who are stirring up conflict and violence where it need not exist. So there are a lot of interesting cases from the 40s, 50s into the early 60s that the FBI is engaged in, sometimes effectively, often less effectively. But I want to get to 1964 and just say a few words about that before we finish up here. One of the most fascinating relationships between any of the presidents, but with any political figure, for me, was Hoover's relationship with Lyndon Johnson. So Hoover was very tight with many Southern Democrats, including James Eastland. They cooperated, famous Mississippi senator. They cooperated around a lot of things, in particular around anti-communist campaigns. Eastland was mostly a friend of the Bureau, except often when it came to civil rights investigations. But he was particularly close with Lyndon Johnson. They had been neighbors beginning in the 1940s. They lived on the same block in Washington. And so by the time Johnson became president, he and Hoover were really very tight. They knew each other quite well. And it is actually Lyndon Johnson that we have to thank for making J. Edgar Hoover essentially FBI director for life. So this is May of 1964. This is Lyndon Johnson in a ceremony at the White House, exempting J. Edgar Hoover from what would have been the mandatory federal retirement age of 70. So Hoover was going to have to leave office on January 1st, 1965. And it is Lyndon Johnson who says, Edgar, that's ridiculous. You're an American icon and an institution. And it is Lyndon Johnson that keeps Hoover in power. So there is, it can be fun and sobering in many ways to speculate what might have happened. Would the rest of the 60s have turned out somewhat differently had Lyndon Johnson not done that? Had we gotten a different director in at the Bureau? But they were very tight, and it's Johnson who kept Hoover in office. So now I want to talk about what they actually did together on the question of civil rights, a lot of which is very focused on events in Mississippi in 1964. And I think like Hoover's earlier history, it is both more dire in many ways than many people know about, and then also more complicated than our kind of public narratives would often suggest. So I also want to identify this man here on the right. That was an FBI official named Deke DeLoach, who was one of Hoover's top officials, really the liaison with the Johnson administration and someone who spent a great deal of time in Mississippi trying to kind of manage events for Hoover. So I think the first thing to say about Lyndon Johnson entering the presidency is that the FBI, for the most part, understood that this was a moment that they were going to be able to take their gloves off around the question of surveillance of civil rights figures, in particular Martin Luther King. So now why would that be, right? I mean, Johnson is the great civil rights president, and we will talk a little bit more about what Hoover did in that. But initially, Hoover had been on the outs with the Kennedy administration. They had been ramping up surveillance of King and his associates, particularly in the wake of the March on Washington. But this is a document from December of 1963, right after the Kennedy assassination. Johnson has become president, in which the heads of the Domestic Intelligence Division and a tight-knit group of agents and officials gather at headquarters to plan an all-out assault on Martin Luther King as a public figure. It involved not only surveillance, but as we saw from the letter, also a disruptive campaign by the end. And as I said, the Bureau really does understand that Lyndon Johnson is going to be okay with this. Lyndon Johnson is both working with Martin Luther King and also somewhat suspicious of him. And in any case, it's an immediate ramping up. Of course, there is a second aspect of what the FBI is doing during those years, which brings us to Mississippi, which is law enforcement investigations, right? In 1963 into 1964, you're seeing a wave of racial violence, often against civil rights activists in the South, and Johnson is putting lots of pressure on the FBI to take charge of them, even in moments where it's not so clear whether or not the FBI has jurisdiction. Of course, one of the most famous, Freedom Summer, the murders of the 3 civil rights activists here in Mississippi. Hoover and Johnson are working together on this front as well. One of the interesting things about the story behind the Freedom Summer investigation, but also the Johnson-Hoover relationship. On the one hand, you've got all of this surveillance, you have infiltration of civil rights groups. A lot of that's being fed back to the White House as political information, but they want to keep that pretty quiet because, of course, Lyndon Johnson's main goal in the summer of 1964 is to get the Civil Rights Act passed. And Johnson actually sees Hoover as being really critical to that. So one of the reasons that they're so focused on the civil rights investigations, and particularly the Freedom Summer murders, is concerned that this is going to somehow disrupt the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And so weirdly, Lyndon Johnson is turning to J. Edgar Hoover and saying, you know, you're going to be my man that shows that federal law enforcement, first of all, can be effective in the South, and secondly, that once the Civil Rights Act is passed, you're going to be my emissary to the South and to Mississippi. So this is, I think, a rather counterintuitive photo, which is Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act and handing one of the pens that he used to sign that to Hoover. Martin Luther King is also in that room. Other figures are in that room. But Johnson understands Hoover as being a kind of effective emissary on this front. Once the Civil Rights Act is passed, Johnson and Hoover get on the phone and they hatch a plan that they think is going to symbolize the ways in which there's going to be a federal presence in the South. And that is that J. Edgar Hoover is going to come here to Jackson, Mississippi, and he is going to personally open the FBI field office here in Jackson. So there's a wild scramble among the agents in the region to set up a field office in just a couple of days, and they sort of refer to it as a Potemkin office. Most of the furniture is not really going to be the furniture that stays there. The walls are a little unstable, right? The office really isn't operational. personal. But Johnson and Hoover think that it's really important to show that there's a new federal presence in Mississippi, partly related to Freedom Summer, but also more broadly. And so this is Hoover in Jackson, Mississippi in the summer of 1964. He is here to open the office, and I think there are a couple of things to mention quickly that are really important. One, Johnson understands that federal power in Mississippi in the summer of 1964 is going to be enormously controversial. But he understands that Hoover might personally be the one person who could come down and actually do this, in part because his history as a critic and opponent of the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King is well known, right? One piece of Hoover's legacy, but also because he is in fact known as a real federal lawman, someone who is going to attempt to enforce the law. And in fact, in Hoover's appearance here, he tries to kind of strike this balance between appeasement and federal presence. So you see Hoover is saying, the South isn't really any worse than the North when it comes to race and racial violence. And as you can see, another headline, right? Popular Hoover eases Mississippi tension, right? The idea that he's going to be some sort of consensus figure. It's worth noting that he does not invite any civil rights activists to this press conference. And in fact, when Medgar Evers' brother tries to meet with him afterwards, Hoover rebuffs civil rights activists and black activists altogether, and then jets back to DC. That man who's whispering at him in the corner, by the way, is Clyde Tolson, Hoover's number 2 at the FBI, also in many ways his life partner. We can talk about that, but Tolson comes down with Hoover as well to open the office. So we have a kind of public story that is about Hoover and Johnson cooperating to not only conduct civil rights investigations, but to establish a real federal presence in the South. But I want to finish up, I guess, with 2 things. One is that in the aftermath of that, Hoover does set the FBI at Johnson's urging after the Klan, particularly in Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama. Many people don't know all the details of that, but to the degree that that's known, there's some public confusion about this, right? There are a lot of people saying, well, J. Edgar Hoover, we would have thought you would be sympathetic to the white South. At any rate, this is a cartoon sort of making that point, but there is a pretty serious and widespread campaign against the Klan that really escalates in the mid to late 1960s. But at the same time, Hoover and Johnson have not given up on what we saw in late 1963, which is not only focusing on surveillance infiltration aimed at King himself, but at the movement more broadly. And so I'll just finish with this image from 1964. This is August 1964, the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. And if you know your Mississippi freedom history, this is the moment that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is making its way up to the Democratic National Convention in an effort to dislodge the all-white delegation from Mississippi and to push for civil rights. So see, these are some of the demonstrations going on outside of the convention there. And what's really dramatic about what's going on behind the scenes is that Lyndon Johnson has gone to Hoover and the FBI, asked them to spy on the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, to bring informants and agents into the convention, and to send back sort of political reports about what they're up to. Johnson doesn't want this disruption at the at the convention. And so he has authorized the FBI to do what is really a pretty purely political set of investigations there. So all of which brings us back to this moment in late 1964 when the FBI is engaged in secret operations that they understand Lyndon Johnson is probably okay with against Martin Luther King, in which Hoover actually then, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, after Johnson's election in late 1964, says, okay, this is a moment when I can now speak out against Martin Luther King more aggressively. I've done my duty to Lyndon Johnson. He's been reelected. The Civil Rights Act has been passed. So there's a famous moment in late 1964 where Hoover calls King the most notorious liar in America. And King has to have a sit down with J. Edgar Hoover to try to work things out. We know how well that went. But I just want to finish up with one last slide, which I think is important for remembering Hoover's story and where it fits into the American story. So I think today we very rightly view, King as an admirable, in many ways almost sainted figure in American history, and Hoover as a great villain. And I think there are great reasons for that. But I think it's also important to go back to 1964 and to remember that at the time, that actually wasn't at all what the world looked like. In the aftermath of that public dispute between Hoover and Martin Luther King, in the aftermath of everything that had happened in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, Freedom Summer, all that had produced the passage of that landmark law. There's a public opinion poll that asks, if you had to kind of weigh this battle between J. Edgar Hoover and Martin Luther King, whose side would you be on? And as you can see here, 50% of the people polled say they would side with Hoover, 16% say they would side with King, and everyone else says they're not quite sure how to think about this. I say this because I think it's important to really remember this history. I think it's important to remember that Hoover, who is often described as a kind of rogue agent, someone running his own agenda, was enormously popular, and he was enormously popular even at the very moments that he was going after a figure like Martin Luther King. And so in the pieces of his story that I've told here, I think we also have to see a larger story about the United States, what it authorized, what it did not authorize, and what we remember and what we choose to forget. So that's about it for my, thank you. So we have a few minutes left for questions. There's a microphone that's going to go around.
Yeah, just a quick question. Where was that original field office in Jackson by the FBI?
So it was, there may be other people here who know that more than I do. My memory is that it was in the federal building, that whatever that federal building was, it was just built.
In the Universe Bank Building
Okay.
on Capitol. My question, how effective do you think the FBI was in dismantling the Klan in Mississippi?
So I think that the FBI, so did you get the answer to that? It was the first, yeah, okay. I think the FBI was pretty effective at dismantling the Klan. So one of the things that was really interesting to me, you may have heard the word COINTELPRO, right? COINTELPRO was the FBI's counterintelligence program, and it's most famous for being aimed at civil rights activists, the anti-war movement, organizations like the Black Panthers, and it was a program of active infiltration and disruption of those groups. So it's notorious, it's famous. I think what's less well known is that there was a COINTELPRO White Hate, which was a series of those very similar operations that were in fact aimed at the Klan, at various white supremacist organizations, and I think that they were pretty effective, both at infiltration, at disruption. I think they were somewhat less effective at prosecution, and in fact, a lot of those other forms of operations were born out of a certain kind of frustration with trying to work with Southern law enforcement officials, trying to make cases in court, and so, in many of those cases, the FBI said, well, we can do this, right? We can do this on our own. We can do this in secret without needing to go through the courts.
How would you characterize Hoover's relationship with media, particularly radio and television? I remember growing up with the weekly television series that portrayed the Bureau very heroically.
Right.
And in the late 60s, I think things started to change a bit.
Exactly. So Hoover, from the 30s through his death, had this enormous PR operation, and that was not only working with the press, having bureau spokespeople go around and speak in schools, but also working with Hollywood, with television, and they were pretty effective at that. So many people still remember the FBI TV series that started in 1965, really just after all of this, in September of 1965, and that was deliberately started in cooperation with the FBI because Hoover was concerned, both coming out of civil rights stuff, rising crime, he's becoming more criticized, particularly from the left, and so that was a very deliberate PR effort to improve the image of the Bureau, and it was run with the cooperation of Bureau headquarters. So.
Yes, my question concerns anti-Semitism. Yesterday, Christopher Wray testified in Congress that it's increased 400% in the United States. Hoover had his problems with unions, looked upon that as communist. He had his problem with Hollywood. That was unions, and that was the Jews, according to references. What was his attitude towards the Jewish population?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and you're absolutely right that certainly where communism was concerned, Hoover thought, there's a big association between kind of Jewish activists and communists, Hollywood as well to some degree, but it wasn't a big theme of his life. He actually had many high-ranking Jewish officials over time, I mean, not huge numbers, but there were several important top bureau officials who were Jewish. He actually had an alliance with the Anti-Defamation League, which rather liked him because he talked a lot about the Judeo-Christian tradition, right, in the language of kind of mid-century life. So the Bureau was certainly built around a kind of Protestant identity, and then later on around hiring, more Catholics and Mormons, and that was pretty important to the way the Bureau presented itself. He wanted his agents to go to church, but he wasn't actively anti-Semitic, didn't, make a big deal out of it. I think there was just a lot of casual anti-Semitism, but there were Jewish agents and such.
Hold on, let me get that mic so everybody can hear your question.
Just to follow up, that in the early 40s, there was quite an anti-Jewish sentiment in the country. I mean, even Henry Ford
For sure.
was receiving praises from Hitler. How did he play that?
Yeah, well, I think Hoover was a man of his time and had many of the biases and prejudices of his time, some more elevated and escalated than others. But, the Bureau was investigating fascist organizations in the 30s and into the 40s. As I said, he had kind of prominent alliances with not only Jewish officials at the FBI, but kind of Jewish officials in judges. So take something like the Rosenberg case, right, which was this big atomic spy case in the early 50s. And there, Hoover knew Julius Rosenberg was guilty, sort of was very aggressively going after him in a way that I think was fueling anti-Semitism. He was also very close with the trial judge, with a figure like Roy Cohn, right, who were both Jewish. And so I think, it tended to be more about political views and political alliances. He certainly didn't like Jewish communists. There's a moment in which there's an attempt to organize a union within part of the FBI in the 1930s. I tell this story in the book. Hoover, of course, crushes this very quickly, but he does complain afterwards that it's because they've been hiring Jews, right? The Jews are going to organize the union. So, I think it's he has certain biases, but they weren't a very prominent part of his legacy.
Thank you. Was Hoover would you say that Hoover was racist, or did he just dislike the civil rights leadership, or did he dislike all black people, or would you say he's a racist? Or?
I think Hoover was racist. I don't think it's the only thing that matters about how he conducted himself in civil rights investigations, but he used racial epithets. He used them toward Martin Luther King, among many other people. The lens through which he's making these judgments about who's dangerous and who's not dangerous is certainly a racist lens. He refuses to hire black agents at the Bureau. So I think there's no question that Hoover is kind of steeped in a racist ideology from very early on and carries that on. That said, you know, it wasn't the only thing that mattered in how he behaved, particularly in civil rights investigations, right? There are a lot of other things from institutional self-interest to political pressure, et cetera, that we have to understand to really figure out why he and the Bureau acted as they did. But absolutely, I mean, Hoover had racist views and they influenced a lot of what happened at the Bureau.
We've come to the top of another hour. I know that once again we have more questions than we have time for. It's one of my favorite things about the series. However, we have copies of Beverly Gage. Did I mention it's a Pulitzer Prize winning book for sale over here? And I bet she'll be glad to talk to you and answer any questions you may have as she's signing copies of that. Thank you all for being here. Don't forget about the programs that we have coming up, the Community Curation Day with photography this weekend, the movie screening at 2 o'clock on Sunday, and then come back next week when Dale Beasley will be with us talking about his book, We Will Not Be Home by Christmas. For now, help me thank Beverly Gage for this fantastic program today.